Next up, I'm very pleased to say we have one of your own here in the New York financial sector, Kyle Bass, who is well known for his acumen on the hedge fund business, but especially, I think, for the work that he has been doing with respect to China, notably with Hong Kong. He is, of course, the chief financial investment officer of Heyman Capital Management. He is also the author of a new piece, which I understand he's going to unveil here and make available to those of you whose emails we have, about the quiet panic in Hong Kong. Kyle Bass, where are you? There you are. Welcome. Come on up.
It's an honor to be here, and an honor to be here with guys like Gordon and Roger. I took a couple of notes. I needed my pom-poms there. Those were great speeches. But I think from the perspective, if you don't mind, I'll start by commenting real quickly on what Roger said. You know, when you look at China's economy, they purport to have an economy that's 15% of global GDP. When you look at cross-border currency settlement, they don't even represent 1% of cross-border currency settlement. So we kind of take their word for their domestic RMB-based economy converted back at a rate that they stipulate as the rate. And we give them credit for being 15% of global GDP. For the last 6 or 7 years, our work has basically shown that China is desperately short of US dollars. They run their own economy where they have RMB, where they control the printing press, and they printed more money than any economy in the history of the world has printed domestically. So they run the printing press, they run the police, right? They run the narrative, and they also control the price level domestically of everything except really their real estate. So they can control their own economy, but what they can't control are their dollar reserves. And I think Roger was getting to the point that the Chinese companies list in Hong Kong primarily, and raise money in both Hong Kong, Europe, and the US. They raise dollars primarily. They're so desperately short dollars, and that's starting to really show itself. And to Roger's point, they're borrowing so many dollars. He was mentioning that we're headed to $1 trillion. In fact, Chinese corporate borrowing in dollars has already eclipsed $1 trillion last year. It's gone to about 1.1 trillion. And the inclusion of the MSCI, as you saw the articles in the Wall Street Journal, saying that China pressured MSCI with all the pressure they could put on them to get their representative weightings increased, which is happening now. They're actually going from 5% weighting to a 20% weighting, which is forcing U.S. retirees that index to these things. All of our money is going into companies that actually don't have Big Four auditors. They actually don't allow audits. They file glossy financial statements or annual reports. I don't mean to go off on a rant here, but I think it's important to understand exactly where China is and what we take for granted, I think, in financial reporting. One of the other issues that you brought up, Roger, was basically the primary and secondary sanctions. As these sanctions on Iran go into place, all of the companies that do business with the Iranian National Oil Company and the Iranian National Shipping Company and everyone that's listed in the primary sanctions are secondarily sanctionable. And that is up to the United States government to go ahead and sanction those secondary entities. But you think about one thing that we can do, I think, with this organization, I think we can also, let's say, issue edicts as far as what the U.S. can do as action items. And one thing we can do is all pensions and endowments run under an IRS exemption, a tax exemption. And so if the IRS issued guidance that said, you're not allowed to invest in primary sanctioned entities, period. It's against the law. And if an entity is secondarily sanctionable, or what we deem to be secondary sanctionable, continuing to do business with primary sanctioned companies, we should just make them, we should force divestment. If you want to keep your tax exemption, you're not allowed to invest in these things. That's trillions of dollars. It's something easy for our country to do. So that's something I chair the risk committee, the largest public endowment in the U.S., University of Texas, and we implemented that policy last year. And so that should happen. That should be a forced happening, I think, from the perspective of the IRS. Comment real quickly on something Gordon said. He said the strongest economy wins, and I think that's exactly true. And Roger proved through working with the Saudis that you could pump enough oil to get oil to $10 and destroy the Russians. And for that, we all thank you, Roger. But I think looking forward to China, we talk about IP theft, and they've stolen, whether you're looking at DoD reports or USTR reports to the president, they steal 200 to 300 billion a year of IP. It's interesting. That's a pretty big number, right? I've never seen one public company file an 8K showing evidence of IP theft. And there's 200 to 300 billion of it a year. So I think we should force public companies that go complain to the government to file 8Ks. All right, so I'm going to get off of that rant because I really enjoyed those prior two speeches. Talking about Hong Kong is functionally relevant to the entire picture of what's going on in China. If you believe that China is desperately short dollars, Hong Kong is where China raises all of its dollars around the world. If you remember how Hong Kong's agreement came with the U.S. and with Great Britain, with the U.S. it came in 1992 in the Hong Kong U.S. Policy Act that Mitch McConnell led in the Senate. It got signed. And basically, we treat Hong Kong as its own sovereign, even though China technically controls Hong Kong. As long as Hong Kong maintains its democratic electoral process, its autonomy in its economy, and its autonomy in its judiciary, we treat them as their own nation, and we have a free trade agreement with them. They're a most favored nation trading status. We don't have any of the tariffs that we put on China, or any of the manner in which we deal with China from a trade perspective doesn't happen to Hong Kong as long as they maintain that autonomy. So I'm going to get into real quickly a quick financial picture of Hong Kong, and then I'm going to talk to you about the political side, because the financial picture of Hong Kong is, let's say, one of the worst in the world. Their banking sector is almost 9 times their GDP. Their household leverage, when you look at private sector credit to GDP in Hong Kong, I have a couple of slides that I want to show you really quickly. And I don't know which order they're in. All right, well, I'll talk here first. Hong Kong used to be the southern port for China. This is a ratio of Hong Kong's GDP in the numerator and China's GDP in the denominator. So this is what represented percentage of China's economic importance did Hong Kong used to represent. So in the mid-90s, it was as high as almost 30%. And what you see is as China ascended the WTO and spent all the money they've spent building out their own southern port infrastructure and their trade infrastructure, Hong Kong's become much less economically relevant, but still very financially relevant to China. It's really important to see how Hong Kong's economy has changed over time as China did that investment in their port infrastructure. The blue bars are goods, and mostly US dollar-based goods. The red bars are services. So Hong Kong used to be a big exporter of goods and a big importer of services. And right around the financial crisis, their economy flipped. And their economy flipped to today. They're actually a massive net US dollar-based goods importer, and they're a services exporter. And they export to China, right? Hong Kong faces China for about 80% of their GDP. What's happened in Hong Kong in the last 10 years is something that will never happen again. So since they're pegged to our currency, the US dollar, they import our rates. So when our rates went to 0 in 2008, their largest trading partner went to the gas pedal, China. So what happened to Hong Kong real estate from 2008 to today is the largest real estate increase in world history. As you all know, Hong Kong real estate is the most expensive real estate in the world. It trades around $10,000 a square foot. And the reason being, it was free money for 10 years, and their largest trading partner was growing double digits. Now that's reversing. Household leverage, when you get private sector credit to GDP in Hong Kong, is now the highest in the world. It's 300% of GDP. The other two lines here are the US and Japan. Their banking sector is now 8.5 times GDP. You guys remember Iceland, Ireland, Cyprus back when the European crisis was happening? Those dominoes fell in the order of the size of their banking system. Hong Kong's banking system is now as large as they were then. With another fun fact, the two largest banks in Hong Kong, HSBC and Standard Chartered, are orphan children of British financial institutions that don't have any British depositors. So I think those banks are in a precarious position. This is the key. So when you run a currency peg to the U.S., you import our rates, and then to defend that peg, you have to have what we call excess reserves. Now this is a busy chart, but let me just put it in perspective. In the last year, Hong Kong has spent 80% of its rainy day fund defending this peg to the U.S. And the only reason pegs work is you have synchronicity in economies. Well, now Hong Kong's economy is much more relevant or say China's economy is much more relevant to Hong Kong than the U.S. And they're spending a lot of their rainy day funds trying to maintain this peg that's existed for 36 years. So it's a subset of what's happening in China. China's house is on fire, and now Hong Kong might need a few fire engines from China, and we're not necessarily sure all of this doesn't revalue. To Gordon's point, and thinking back to the fall of the Soviet Union, it looks to us like I don't want to say fraud, but let's say the disingenuous nature of the exchange rate between the RMB and the USD, given the fact that China is completely running out of dollars and raising dollars through Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is as levered as it is and running out of its own rainy day funds. If you have money invested in Asia, I would rethink that, and I'd rethink it very quickly. And if you have Hong Kong dollar deposits, you'd be foolish not to convert them into US dollar deposits, because you don't even earn 80 basis points more in overnight rates. So I think this is multifaceted. You need to think about the nexus of Hong Kong and China economically, but then we go to the politics. And I know a lot of you here are political animals. So if you've noticed in the last month or so, China has actually floated a proposal through Hong Kong's legislature that says they would just like to extrajudicially grab people off the streets of Hong Kong if China deems them to be a, quote, fugitive. And a fugitive means that they've broken a law that happens to be a law in China and Hong Kong. Let's just use murder, for example. If President Xi issues a warrant of arrest and calls the Hong Kong police and says, hey, this person XYZ committed murder in China and he's there in Hong Kong, we want you to ship him over to us. Hong Kong's going to be obliged to do that without due process. Now, that's not autonomous anymore. That is a breach of the 1992 agreement that the US has with Hong Kong. It's a breach of the 1984 agreement that the Brits have with Hong Kong. And so China, I believe, is overplaying their hand in a big way in Hong Kong, and I think this legislation is about to become law. The most interesting thing about these agreements is the 1992 Hong Kong-US Policy Act is re-ratified annually by the US President. The State Department owes a report to the President, and then it's up to the President to decide whether or not Hong Kong is still, quote, autonomous enough for us to give them the status that they currently have. So given the economic fragility of the region, and going back to Gordon's point, China's in a really bad place today. Running out of dollars, slowing with their economy, and the biggest credit binge in world history. Hong Kong is the most levered developed nation in the world today, and they're running out of dollars. We have them exactly where we want them right now. We should not sign a trade deal with them. We should go ahead and impose these tariffs and then negotiate something much more meaningful with them 6 months down the road. So I think you need to pay attention to both the politics and the economics of Hong Kong, which for 36 years has been a relatively stable place in Asia, and I think going forward that's actually not going to be the case. So Frank, thanks for having me.